Hi everyone, thank you all for joining us on Zoom and YouTube. I'm Yixuan and I'll be hosting this morning session. Today's webinar theme is on a city in nature for coastal resilience. So, have you ever wondered, as sea levels rise due to climate change, how can we keep our coastline safe while ensuring a livable environment? Well, today we will be sharing with you how natural habitats and urban infrastructure can work together in harmony to mitigate and adapt to climate change. Today, we are joined by Mr. Zestin, Senior Manager from the Conservation Department, who will be giving an introduction to nature-based solutions. You will also be able to hear from Mr. Jonathan Tan, Manager from the National Biodiversity Centre, who will be sharing more on various examples of nature-based solutions that are applied in Singapore. We are also glad to have with us Associate Professor Dan Fries, the NUS Centre for Nature-Based Climate Solutions, who will be sharing how we can utilize the myriad benefits of our coastal habitats to make a more climate resilient Singapore. Before we begin, we would like to first get everyone to participate in a small quiz activity to get everyone warmed up before our main event. To access the quiz page, you may either scan the QR code that is shown on the screen, or you can click the link that is pasted on the Zoom chat. I will give everyone a few moments to log into Mentimeter before I switch my screen to the quiz page. All right, I see that the hearts are coming in, so some of you guys have joined. I'll just wait a few more moments for more people to join. All right, I'll start a poll when we hit 20 people. All right, okay, let's begin. So the first question is, how are you feeling today on this very Saturday morning? Great, excited. Yeah, it's great to see that most of you guys are excited. For those of you who are sleepy, I feel you as well. I'm not a morning person, but hopefully when the presenters come up, we'll feel more awake. Yeah, it's great to see that most of you guys are excited, happy, or curious. Oh no, a lot of you guys are sleepy. Hopefully the webinar will really wake you guys up. Okay, let us move on to the next question. All right, the next question is, which of the following best reflects your feelings towards climate change? Okay, it's interesting to see that a lot of you guys are anxious and sad as well. We have 2 of you guys who are very optimistic. Okay, that's a very interesting result. We know the results are really quite varied. Okay, let us move on to the next question, which I believe will also be the last question. So in one word, describe what you are looking forward to from today's webinar. It can be any word, just in one word. All right, I'm seeing mangroves. Yes, we will definitely be touching on mangroves as nature-based solutions. I'm seeing solutions. Yep. Information, definitely. Knowledge, understanding. Yep. These are great. Keep them coming in. Yeah, so the bigger words miss is the most common answer. So I'm seeing solutions, inspiration, enlightenment as a common thread among the audience. Knowledge as well, yeah. Yeah, so hopefully you will be able to glean really insightful information from today's webinar. So thank you all for your active participation and responses. Now that we are all warmed up, let us kickstart the webinar proper. Sorry, just give me a moment to switch back. Sorry about that. Okay, yeah. So before we begin, I would like to give everyone a heads up that there will be short quizzes throughout the presentations with seed packets to be won if you are the first to enter the correct answer in the Zoom chat. So do look out for that. It will be very exciting. So with that, let me now invite my colleague Zestin to take over the presentation. Zestin, please.
Thanks, Yishan, for the introduction. And good morning, everyone. I'm Zestin from NParks. Today, we'll be sharing about how becoming a city in nature strengthens our coastal resilience in the face of climate change. First off, it's important to understand what we're facing, namely the threats of climate change. During the 2019 National Day rally, Prime Minister Lee sounded the alarm on these impacts that will affect all dimensions of our lives, including our water supply, energy demand, and public health. These impacts are already being felt in Singapore and expected to worsen over the coming decades. The first impact is rising temperatures. And in cities like ours, this is worsened by a phenomenon called the urban heat island effect, which is the amplification of temperatures in densely built up areas. The second impact is increased intensity and frequency of extreme weather events, such as storms. And the third is rising sea levels, driven primarily by the melting of glaciers and ice sheets and the thermal expansion of seawater as it warms. The average sea level around Singapore has already risen 14 centimeters above pre-1970s levels, and by 2100, sea levels is projected to rise by another 1 meter. These last two impacts, more frequent extreme weather events and rising sea levels, together contribute to the risk of flooding in Singapore. Being a low-lying island city-state surrounded by the sea, Singapore is especially vulnerable to this threat. This is a map of Singapore under a projected future scenario of climate change, and it shows that significant areas, especially the low-lying coastal regions, are very much at risk of flooding unless there are interventions. But how exactly does climate change cause impacts such as coastal flooding? The entire process is complex, but partly driven by a coincidence of three events: high tide, storm surges, and sea level rise. We can see how it works through this simple illustration. First, let's say that at high tide, the seawater currently reaches this level. During storms, a phenomenon called a storm surge may occur. This is a temporary rise in coastal sea levels caused by salt water being pushed towards the shore by high-speed winds under low atmospheric pressure. In this current situation shown, there will be no problem to this building, even with the two factors of storm surge and high tide combined. However, climate change causing average sea levels to rise, plus storm surge and high tide, together make coastal flooding of this building much more likely to occur in the future. And there are other coastal impacts of climate change as well. Heavier and more frequent inland rainfall may overwhelm stormwater management systems and compound coastal flooding. Physical coastlines are also increasingly at risk of being eroded with sea level rise and storms. With these real impacts on the horizon, it's critical that we prepare ourselves for climate change now. Thankfully, though, we aren't alone in our defense against the threats of climate change on our coast. In fact, we have allies here in Singapore that are quietly at work providing benefits that enhance our coastal resilience. These allies I'm referring to are the coastal ecosystems along our shorelines. They include mangroves, seagrass meadows, coral reefs, and many others. Not only do these ecosystems host rich biodiversity, they also provide an array of ecosystem services, including buffering the impacts of climate change on our coast. Take, for example, the mangrove ecosystem, which occurs in coastal areas such as Sungai Buloh Wetland Reserve and Pasir Ris. Mangrove forests, with their dense aerial roots, as shown here, pose an obstacle to waves. This can help dissipate wave energy and reduce the ability of storm surges to cause erosion or flooding on our coast. Research, which Dr. Fries will be touching on later during this talk, has shown that mangroves in Singapore can reduce wave height by over 75%. In addition, mangroves encourage the buildup of soil along their roots, helping to reinforce coasts against erosion. This process also stores carbon and helps to mitigate climate change. Other coastal ecosystems like seagrass meadows and coral reefs can serve similar roles, and interestingly, can work in tandem to provide a greater overall positive effect for coastal resilience. It's because of these and other benefits of nature that the Singapore Green Plan 2030 was launched last year with City in Nature as the first of its 5 pillars. By restoring nature throughout our city-state, Singapore becomes a greener, more livable and sustainable home, even in the face of climate change. And this brings us to an important and exciting term in today's topic of coastal resilience: nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions, simply put, are actions that leverage on ecosystems to effectively and adaptively address societal challenges, such as those caused by climate change. These solutions involve protecting, sustainably managing, and restoring ecosystems. And the outcome of these solutions are benefits to both people and biodiversity alike. Traditionally, coastal protection has relied wholly on engineered infrastructure. These can be very effective in their role, but have some limitations compared to Mother Nature. The structures are unable to self-repair or grow on their own to keep pace with sea level rise. In addition, they often have little to no value to biodiversity conservation, although they can be multifunctional when implemented innovatively, such as in providing spaces for recreation. Looking back at nature-based solutions, these have some potential characteristics that make them increasingly of interest worldwide. For example, they can offer multiple benefits and functions: flood protection, recreational spaces, and enhance the resilience of our natural ecosystem. They are also potentially cheaper to build and maintain. Several of these benefits are illustrated in Bishan Ang Mo Kio Park, which serves as a floodplain following heavy storms. Nature solutions are also potentially adaptable, able to grow and keep pace along impacts such as sea level rise. What's also important to know is that there is, in fact, a great variety of nature-based solutions, and they range from soft or fully natural solutions on one end to hard solutions involving mostly built structures at the other. In between these two extremes are what we call hybrid solutions, which combine both natural and built features and can harness the best characteristics of both. Jonathan and Dan will be touching on many of these examples of nature-based solutions in Singapore later in this webinar. Given that the nature-based solutions are potentially important to climate resilience, what are the opportunities to implement them in Singapore? Well, first, effective implementation of nature-based solutions is dependent on the specific context, such as the local environment and land use types, as well as the type of impact that needs addressing. One starting point is to also look at the kinds of habitats in the area. Broadly, this habitat map of Singapore shows us the slivers of coastal habitats that serve as soft nature-based solutions around our country. Focusing on the shorelines, only 30% of the current extent comprise natural habitats of muddy, rocky, or sandy shores, while 70% are covered by engineered structures. These engineered coastlines can also still be enhanced further with hard or hybrid nature-based solutions. All right, now before I pass on to Jonathan, it's time for the first quiz of today's webinar. As Ishan mentioned, this is an opportunity for one of our viewers to win a gift from us. To take part, simply type your answers in the Zoom chat. And the fastest correct answer I can see on my screen will win the prize. All right, so if everyone is ready, here's the question. Name 3 types of coastal ecosystems that contribute to coastal resilience in Singapore. Okay, I think I've got the answer and I've got the winner with me here. So the winner is Joash Cheong, and his answers are coral reefs, mangroves, and seagrasses. Congrats, Joash. We'll be in touch with you for your prize. So the answers, as mentioned, are these ecosystems, but there are a variety of other ecosystems that provide this service as well. And these, for example, are sandy beaches and coastal forests. Thanks for everyone for taking part. Now I'll pass on to Jonathan to share more about the different types of coastal nature-based solutions in Singapore.
Thanks, Zestin. So the aim of this part of the talk today is to also show you guys how coastal nature-based solutions in Singapore are not anything new. It's something that we've been doing for quite a number of years. And hopefully you come away inspired to see how nature can help provide solutions to the challenges that we face from climate change. Okay, so there are quite a variety of coastal nature-based solutions, as Zestin alluded to earlier. You do have solutions that essentially mean retrofitting hard engineering solutions. So one example is seawall enhancement. Some of you who have visited Changi Beach Park may have noticed these tidal pool units along Car Park 5. So this is an experimental project where NParks actually put artificial tidal pools onto the seawall to help promote biodiversity. And they do work actually to some extent, and you actually be able to find animals like this cuttlefish or the purple climbing crab that make use of these habitats that the tidal pools provide. Another experimental project which we work together with researchers on is bioboss tiles. So these are biodiversity enhancement tiles that help create microhabitats along seawalls. They increase the habitat complexity and they help retain seawater better, which prevents the environment from drying out. And that allows a greater variety of seaweeds and hence snails, shellfish, and crustaceans to live amongst the tiles. So the idea behind these interventions is to help our natural seawall, our artificial seawalls mimic natural rocky shores, which have a lot more complexity than what would otherwise be a smooth and relatively sterile surface. So far, most of these have been experimental or pilot projects, but we are looking at how we can upscale this to more places. Some of you may also be familiar with these floating reefs at Marina Keppel Bay. So this again is an example of how we can turn relatively hard and artificial structures into biodiversity habitat as well. This marina is actually built in a way that allows ocean currents to freely flow through the marina, which brings nutrients as well as larvae of all sorts of marine creatures into the area. At the same time, there are strict controls on the boat wakes so that large waves are not generated, and the use of biodegradable detergents is mandated for boat owners for washing their boats. And because of this good water quality and sheltered environment, it allows a really rich variety of corals and other animals to live amongst the reef. So for instance, you'll be able to find seahorses, clownfish, and even sea turtles living amongst these corals. Oh, sorry, I just ran into a technical difficulty. Give me a moment. Yeah, okay, sorry about that. My monitor went off. Okay, yeah, so with nature-based solutions like these, we can actually introduce biodiversity and recreational value into what would otherwise be a highly functional space. And we can ensure that city in nature is something that is under the water as well as above the water. Moving on to even larger scales, where we want to make use of nature-based solutions for habitat restoration. In 2018, JTC worked together with NParks to install 8 multi-story artificial reefs at Sisters Island Marine Park. And the project was highly successful. Within just a few months, large numbers of fish started to make use of the reefs for shelter. Algae, sponges, and shellfish, including things like lobsters, actually colonized these reefs. And within 1 year, we started to see new corals that were naturally recruiting onto the reef. And we have also started to transplant mature corals onto this reef. So one thing to note about this project was that the goal of the project was not originally to provide coastal protection. And in fact, the reefs were designed deliberately to reduce the hydrodynamic impact onto the natural ecosystem there. But examples of artificial reefs in other countries have actually shown that you can deliberately design them to help break wave action and therefore provide coastal protection function. So this is something that we can consider looking at as we move forward. Looking at mangroves, which Dan will be talking a bit more about later on, NParks has also been working on mangrove coastal protection for quite a number of years. In 2011, we discovered that the mangrove forest at Pulau Tekong, which is the largest pristine mangrove left in Singapore, was suffering from severe erosion because of waves that were coming from shipping traffic. So what we actually did was that we built this low rock revetment, you can see at the bottom left, of riprap rocks. And these rocks actually have gaps between the rocks that allow mangroves to continue growing on the revetment. There were a mix of mangroves that we planted using planter rings. So you see some of the mangrove saplings at the bottom, they're actually coming out of these circular rings. But we also saw within a couple of years, natural mangroves that were settling on top of this seawall. So the idea here is that we, instead of just building, a normal seawall to stop erosion, you can actually design rock revetments that are able to interact with our mangroves to form a hybrid system, and they continue to support the health of the ecosystem. Moving forward, we've also implemented something similar at Kranji Coastal Nature Park with a tweak design. So the context here is slightly different. You'll see that the rock revetment was actually built behind an existing mangrove line because unlike Tekong, the ecosystem here was one where we had a transition from terrestrial forest towards mangroves. And with this gentler revetment slope that we used, it also promoted sediment accretion and allowed natural mangroves to quickly recruit. So you can see between 2019 and 2021 on the right, there's this small line of short shrubs. That's actually baby mangroves that have naturally settled just behind the original mangrove line. And then behind this mangrove revetment, we have a coastal forest zone. What we've done is to do community tree planting as part of the 1 million trees movement. And we want to enhance the ecological resilience of the whole system by restoring the natural spectrum of habitat coming from terrestrial forest to coastal forest and back mangrove down into the true mangrove. So this is another cross-section that shows you this transition zone. And we expect that as sea levels rise, this back mangrove now becomes sort of a buffer area. Instead of seawater directly reaching the terrestrial forest, this area will be flooded first and potentially also form a zone where mangroves that are at the more seaward edge will slowly migrate inland. Mangrove river naturalization is also something that is not new in Singapore. As many of you may know, lots of our rivers nowadays are relatively straight. And this was because there was the need to linearize our natural waterways for flood control purposes. Because a straight waterway is able to transport storm water to the sea much more quickly. But there are ways of designing these very important flood control drains in ways that are also good habitat for mangrove river. For mangroves. So you can see on the left, that's Sungai Api-Api, which runs through the HDB estate at Pasir Ris. This was a joint project between HDB and PUB, where the channel was deliberately dug to be wide and deep enough to serve the stormwater drainage function, but at the same time double as a mangrove river. And a whole load of different species have actually taken root here. You have smooth-coated otters and the oriental pied hornbill, which up to the 90s were considered extinct on the mainland. There are also other waterways which are without human intervention have naturally regenerated into mangrove river systems. So for instance, Belaya Creek or Sungai Pangsua. And this suggests that our mangroves, if we can design our waterways right, are actually able to come back on their own even without active human intervention. Of course, active human intervention can speed things up a lot. So mangrove planting is something that Singapore has been doing for many decades. For instance, you can see at the left at Pulau Semakau, when the landfill was built at Pulau Semakau, great efforts were made to preserve the majority of the existing mangrove forest. And because of the recognition that some mangroves would still be impacted, NEA actually planted 400,000 new mangrove saplings to expand the mangrove forest there. So the challenges of planting a mangrove forest from scratch are not trivial. What they actually did was they raised the elevation of the seabed just by a little so that the mangrove saplings could survive. And then they built a low rock revetment similar to what we did at Tekong on the outside rim. And this provided the necessary shelter for these saplings to grow up. And today you will see on the right, bottom right corner, these planted mangroves now form a great wall that can potentially be acting as an effective erosion barrier against wave action, although more study is probably needed to quantify this. And in our nature reserves, we have also been doing active mangrove planting, for instance at Sungai Buloh. Although many people know it today as one of Singapore's richest mangroves, it wasn't always this case. In fact, in the 80s, this place used to be used for prawn farming, and the mangroves were substantially smaller in area. But thanks to a mix of natural regeneration and restoration work by NParks, we now have a much larger and healthier mangrove below. And well, as I mentioned and alluded to earlier, sometimes we want to just work with nature instead of doing all the work ourselves. So this is called ecological mangrove restoration. It's something that has been tried on a small scale before at Pasir Ris Park. Many of you might be familiar with this area. You may not know that actually a large portion of these mangroves are regenerated as a result of deliberate engineering, where platform levels and the topography of the land was lowered so that instead of being normal terrestrial vegetation, it would be overtaken by mangroves. And this is something that we are now working at Pulau Ubin. So restore Ubin mangroves, that's something which Dr. Fries is heavily involved in. It's actually a community initiative and advocate group for the mangroves of Pulau Ubin. These volunteers conducted a wide variety of flora surveys and outreach activities to figure out what the best way to restore Ubin's mangroves were in a way that is dependent on nature rather than too much human intervention. So the idea is to modify the hydrology there so that mangroves can grow back on their own. And Dr. Fries will talk a bit more about that later on. So those are existing solutions which were implemented deliberately, but there are also quite a number of coastal nature-based solutions which were so-called accidental, meaning that when they were first built, these coastal protection structures were not done with the intention of restoring biodiversity, but inadvertently, rich diversity now has overgrown these places, and we can learn quite a lot of lessons from them. So one of these examples is seawall reefs. Although we mentioned earlier that generally seawalls tend to be sterile, there are a number of seawalls in Singapore which, because of the environmental conditions that they are in, have become naturally settled by hard corals. Sometimes the density of coral here can even exceed certain natural reefs because of how stable the seawall is. So these corals are, in addition to being an endangered ecosystem that is naturally regenerating on artificial substrate, they may also provide some degree of wave attenuation function. So they further protect the shoreline from erosion. And even though all these places were not done purposely, we can actually learn valuable lessons. So for instance, we just need to design seawalls with the right conditions. And we aim for gentler slopes in shallow water to support more coral. Another example is actually sheltered tidal flats or lagoons. So if you visit, for instance, East Coast Park or even some of our southern islands, you will find lots of sandy beaches. And many of these beaches, because of the sheltered lagoon structure, they actually become host to seagrass meadows and coral rubble habitats, in addition to being recreational areas for beach activities. And again, there are some principles we can learn from these, right? We want these places to not be too shallow because otherwise marine life would be exposed to the sun most of the time. And we also don't want them to be too deep if we want the general public to be able to see them. And the idea is to try and replicate similar designs going forward. So these are just some examples of the many kinds of species that can be found in these sheltered tidal flats, even on mainland Singapore. So you can get seahorses, octopuses, sea stars, and sea slugs that will colonize these man-made lagoons that are found along our recreational beaches. Having said all this, there are still quite lots of gaps in knowledge in how we're going to implement coastal nature-based solutions going forward, because many of the examples I've mentioned, they were not designed with climate change in mind. And there are quite a number of research questions that still remain, right? For instance, how much erosion protection can they provide? How well can they keep pace with rising seas? We know that, natural systems can grow with environmental change, but is it enough? There are times where we might have to integrate natural habitats with hard engineering solutions to prevent inundation. And we also need to look at the coastal system and the inland system as one big system. So NParks and other government agencies are working to address these questions through research. So just very briefly, we are now the implementing agency for the Marine Climate Change Science Program, which is looking at various challenges that the marine environment will face as a result of climate change. We're looking not just at the hard science areas such as blue carbon or eco-engineering, but also at social science areas like community-driven climate resilience planning. And with this $25 million research program, we hope to be able to answer some of the questions I mentioned earlier. So some of the key takeaways from the talk that Zestin and I have, we hope that you remember. One is that nature-based solutions, or NBS, are able to offer multiple co-benefits over traditional ones, which makes them more cost-effective. But at the same time, in Singapore's context, many of the examples we've mentioned will involve some hybrid version of a natural habitat as well as human engineering. And there are going to be times when hard barriers are unavoidable, but even then, there are interventions we can do to ensure that biodiversity flourishes. Ultimately, the goal is to build things right through design and allow biodiversity to come back on its own without us having to do too much active planting and restoration work. But we still need to do more research and development so that we can ensure these NBS are able to face up to the challenges that we expect from climate change. Okay, so now for our second quiz question, similar to what Zestin did earlier, I'm going to ask a question. You type your answers in the Zoom chat and we will pick out the first correct answer to win a small gift. Okay, so the question is, name 3 places where coastal nature-based solutions can be found in Singapore. Okay, I've got one answer in already. Sorry, I'm not too sure what your full name is. It's lim_e. So the answer from them is Sungai Buloh Wetland Reserve, East Coast, and Tanah Merah. Yeah. So these are actually 3 good examples of very different nature-based solutions. Sungai Buloh, we have natural mangroves. At East Coast Park, we have sheltered lagoons, and at Tanah Merah Ferry Terminal, we have seawall reefs. Okay, I see. It's Doreen and Eugene. Right. Thanks everyone for participating. And now I'd like to be talking a bit about how mangroves can contribute to coastal resilience in Singapore.
Hi, everyone. First of all, thanks for the really kind invitation to speak to you today. Really appreciate it. Thank you. So Jonathan gave you some really great examples of nature-based solutions around Singapore, and those examples didn't just come about by accident. but they were informed by a lot of science and evidence to make sure that these nature-based solutions will actually work in our context. And I want to kind of give you a bit of background on what some of that science and evidence looks like. Okay, so when we talk about nature-based solutions, that term can actually mean a number of different things. I often like to think about it in terms of nature-based solutions to climate change, though we can use them for other coastal hazards. And the great thing about nature-based solutions and why our coastal ecosystems are just so awesome is that they provide a number of adaptations to climate change, all for free. We don't pay for them, but we get the benefit from them. And this slide here just shows some of the sort of benefits that we get from nature for free. But when it comes to coastal nature-based solutions, there's a couple of key types, and these are the ones that I'll be talking about shortly. We often think about nature-based solutions, first of all, in terms of their ability to help mitigate climate change by either offsetting our emissions or by taking some of our emissions out of the atmosphere and storing them within the solution. And so I'll talk a little bit about this new and emerging concept of blue carbon. But there's also an element of adapting to climate change because mitigating climate change on its own is going to be very difficult, and we're still going to be having to adapt to some of the legacy effects of climate change. And there's lots of ways that we can use nature-based solutions to do that, either by cooling our local climate or by protecting our coasts and regulating floods and things like that. So these are some of the aspects of nature-based solutions that I'll talk about and show some of the evidence that we have in Singapore specifically behind some of these. And what's been really interesting is that the evidence that I'm going to show you has really kind of spurned a lot of interest globally and regionally, but specifically in Singapore, about the interest in how we can use our natural ecosystems to help create a more resilient coastline for Singapore. So the first one I mentioned was climate change mitigation, and this is a concept called blue carbon. Basically, our coastal ecosystems, particularly mangroves and seagrasses, are really efficient at taking our carbon dioxide emissions from the atmosphere, sucking them up through photosynthesis, and storing them in their trunks, their branches, their leaves, but particularly in the soil. And blue carbon ecosystems are really good at this because their soils are waterlogged. And so when a branch falls off a tree and hits the surface of a rainforest, a lot of things break down those branches and leaves, and any carbon contained in them is released back into the atmosphere. But that doesn't happen in waterlogged soils because we don't have the same kind of bacteria and fungi. And so instead of being released into the atmosphere, that carbon accumulates in the soils over thousands of years. And so it makes mangroves and seagrasses really efficient and effective blue carbon storers. And we measure this carbon with a couple of different techniques that I show in some of these photos. We take soil cores and burn soil samples in the lab. We measure the trees, and we measure the rapid emissions from the soils themselves. And when we do all of those measurements, we come up with graphs like this. Now, this graph shows the number of tons of carbon per hectare stored by different ecosystems. In this case, in Chek Jawa and in Bukit Timah. And we can see here that our mangroves are able to store about 500 tons of carbon per hectare in Chek Jawa. Our seagrasses are about 160 tons of carbon per hectare. Our mudflats are similar. And if we look at similar measurements in Bukit Timah Nature Reserve, we can see that our mangroves per hectare store about twice as much carbon as our tropical rainforests. And again, you can see that most of this is trapped in the soil. And so it means that you get kind of more bang for your buck with mangroves, and you can store more carbon for the same area. Of course, it also means if we lose mangroves, then we lose disproportionately more carbon per hectare as well. So this is an issue when we think about how to protect and conserve our mangroves. Now, we don't have a lot of mangrove and seagrass and other blue carbon habitats in Singapore, but even despite their small area, because they are so carbon dense, it means that actually we can still store a lot of carbon even within our small coastal habitats. So we've been able to calculate nationally that our mangroves store more than 1.6 million tons of carbon dioxide. This total storage is equivalent to the annual emissions of well over 600,000 people. So, they are punching above their weight and certainly are contributing significantly to our overall carbon storage in Singapore. But it's not just mitigating climate change, it's also adapting to the impacts of climate change. And our coastal ecosystems are also able to do this. So this is one of the first studies in the world where we quantified the impact of coastal ecosystems on reducing our temperatures. We have the urban heat island effect in Singapore, where all of our buildings and concrete surfaces are contributing to increased temperatures, which are then going to be increased even further by climate change. And actually, our coastal ecosystems are able to reduce some of the temperatures compared to surrounding urban areas. So by putting a number of temperature sensors in the mangroves, we were able to show that the mangrove was 3 degrees cooler than the surrounding urban areas. I must admit, when you're doing field work in a mangrove, it doesn't automatically feel 3 degrees cooler. It still feels pretty warm. But this is a substantial influence on our overall urban climate. But it's not just temperatures that we're going to have to adapt to in a warming world. It's also things like sea level rise and increased coastal erosion. And our coastal ecosystems, again, are our first barrier against some of these coastal hazards. So we've been able to show that during large storms, mangroves are able to reduce incoming wave heights by more than 75%. And what this graph shows is that you don't even need a lot of mangrove to do that. Even within the first 100 meters of a mangrove, we're getting these substantial reductions in wave height. And this is all due to those complex roots that mangroves have. They have a lot of their roots above the ground. And when a wave hits those roots, there's a lot of friction, and it takes a lot of the energy out of the wave, so that the wave at the back of the mangrove is substantially reduced compared to the wave height at the front of the mangrove. So if we can combine mangroves with coastal protection, for example, it means that the landward sea wall doesn't have to be as tall and maybe has reduced maintenance costs, because that mangrove in front is helping to reduce the incoming wave heights. And so the evidence is pretty clear that our coastal ecosystems, even within their small extent across Singapore's coast, are able to provide these benefits. We have the evidence and the science to back up those claims. And of course, we can do a lot to increase those benefits as well. And it's great to see in Singapore a number of different initiatives which are helping to utilize these coastal ecosystems as nature-based solutions. The first thing we can do is to protect the habitats that we already have. And that will ensure that those benefits that they're producing will continue to be produced. And we see a lot of examples over the last couple of years of a rapid expansion in the areas of mangroves that are under management and protection. So we're seeing new nature parks being opened. In Mandai, the expansion of the Sungai Buloh Nature Park Network, Kate Bongsu and others, so that we can really start to manage our systems to produce more of these nature-based solution benefits. But that only gets us so far, and actually there's a lot of scope to increase these benefits even further by restoring habitats in places where they used to be, but are no longer there. And Jonathan gave you some great examples of some of them, and I just want to focus on one of them, which is ongoing at the moment, and this is the Restore Ubin Mangroves Initiative, which has led to the Sungai Durian Mangrove Restoration Project. The Restore Ubin Mangroves is really close to my heart because it was a really fun project where a lot of community advocates, nature advocates, academia, and even local stakeholders on Ubin all got together to think about where we could do mangrove rehabilitation across Ubin. And also to advocate for a technique of restoration which encourages more natural regeneration and fixing the environment so that a restoration is more successful. So it was a really fun project, bringing together a lot of people who were passionate about restoration, and then working with NParks colleagues to see where restoration could happen. And part of that project was understanding how we can recreate mangroves, because it can be challenging, and we have a lot of examples in the region where mangrove restoration really hasn't worked. And it's because we don't get the environment right. It's just like planting any plant in your garden. You need to have the right conditions that those plants can grow. And it becomes more difficult with coastal habitats because the coast is a very stressful environment. Your plants are being hit by waves and flooding by the tide and high salinity. And all of these stresses make it very difficult for plants to grow unless the physical conditions are right. And so we did a lot of mapping to understand what are the physical requirements of mangrove species, and then how can we design restoration projects that match those conditions, particularly in abandoned aquaculture ponds, of which there are a number on Ubin. And when you create an aquaculture pond, you change the environment quite significantly. And so if we were just to put mangroves in those ponds without doing any assessment, they probably wouldn't survive. And we see this already because a lot of these aquaculture ponds don't have any natural regeneration of mangroves. So it tells you that something is blocking mangroves from growing naturally. So we did over a period of a few years, a number of measurements across Ubin to understand what the physical environment should look like and how we can redesign these aquaculture ponds to be able to create those conditions. And so we came up with these kind of maps and models where we look particularly at the elevation of the ponds, because if the ponds are too low in their elevation, they'll be flooded more frequently, and they'll be flooded beyond the tolerance that different mangroves can survive. So once we create these kind of models and take these measurements, we can predict where different mangrove species will grow in these ponds. We can predict how much we may need to raise the elevation of the pond and what other conditions we might need to change so that the conditions are optimal for mangroves to survive. And it's really exciting that after taking all of those measurements, the NParks announced that the Sungai Durian project will go ahead. And so we should expect to see engineering of and assessments of these ponds to be conducted over the coming years. And hopefully in a few years, you'll be able to visit these places and see that there are mangroves in places where they didn't used to be. And over time, we'll start to see some of these nature-based solutions, such as coastal protection, such as the carbon sequestration coming back into these places. And so this is really exciting and goes to show how science can work with the translation of science to really come up with concrete projects which will benefit our coastlines for years to come. And just one other example of how we can bring back some of these nature-based solutions in places where it might be more difficult, or maybe we don't have a huge amount of space, is to combine engineered structures with natural structures. And we, again, have been working with NParks and other colleagues to see the feasibility of some of these approaches in Singapore. So again, on Ubin, you might see some of these structures where we're growing mangroves within engineered planting pods to see what are the conditions that we can get mangroves to best grow within these kind of more hard engineered structures. So that's kind of what we've been doing over the last decade or more. But we're not stopping there. And actually, we're pushing the boundaries of our nature-based solution knowledge even further. So a few things that are on the horizon is a new project identifying the barriers and the opportunities to incorporate nature-based solutions into Singapore and Southeast Asia's coastal environment, continuing to work on mangrove restoration and particularly monitoring the success of restoration interventions. We have a large project where we're trying to understand, we've measured a lot of blue carbon for well over a decade in Singapore, but it can be quite technical and expensive to do. So we're looking at how we can simplify the measurements and create more cost-effective protocols so that we can start to roll out blue carbon solutions much more effectively. And finally, we have proposals to look at how we can use blue carbon within Singapore to contribute to our nationally determined contributions, which are reports that we have to submit every 5 years to the United Nations to show how we are combating climate change. And we really do believe that blue carbon in mangroves, in seagrasses, and potentially other sea ecosystems such as our algae and our mudflats might be able to contribute to this initiative. And certainly, this isn't all just science that happens in the universities and doesn't involve anyone else. As you saw with the Restore Ubin Mangroves initiative, there are opportunities for everyone to get involved in incorporating nature-based solutions. And so these are just some of the examples of organizations or groups that are interested in using coastal nature-based solutions, and many of them you are able to get involved in, whether it's the 1 Million Trees movement, whether it's the Restore Ubin Mangroves initiative, or coastal cleanups run by Nature Society Singapore, or many others. So, the responsibility for nature-based solutions is with all of us, and we really do hope that you'll join us on this journey. So thank you very much. Climate change is a threat, but our coastal environment is here to help us. So thank you.
Thank you, Dan, as well as Jonathan and Zestin for the insightful sharing. We will now move on to the Q&A segment of today's webinar. So for this Q&A session, we will be addressing a few questions that some of you have indicated in the sign-up form. So the first question from the audience is, what are the key facts to know about wave attenuation by mangroves in Singapore? Oops, sorry. Let me just go back to the first question. Yeah. So for this question, I would like to invite Dan to share his thoughts with us.
Sure, thank you. It's a great question, and there are maybe a couple of key takeaways to understand. I think, first of all, that our mangroves can protect our coasts, and that you don't need a lot of mangrove to do it. I think that's number one, because there might be a misconception that you need a very large area of mangroves to be able to attenuate or reduce incoming waves, and actually we don't. We only need a small amount, so that gives us, I think, a lot of hope to use this nature-based solution within Singapore's coastal context. I think another key fact to know is also to understand the limitations and the fact that mangroves can attenuate wave energy, but they can reduce the risk. But often we might need to use them in conjunction with other solutions, particularly engineered solutions. So certainly mangroves may not be able to do it on their own, but they are a key contributor to reducing wave energy. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Dan. All right, let's move on to the next question. So what are the benefits and limitations of nature-based solutions to climate change challenges? So I think our speakers have touched on this topic, but I'll just invite Zestin as well as Jonathan to maybe provide a summary of the key points that we should take note of. Zestin, please.
Okay, I'll go ahead first. Thanks, Ishan. So yeah, in a nutshell, I think some of the key strengths of nature-based solutions, as Dan touched on, nature can provide many of these benefits for free. Nature has it's really multifunctional. They provide a range of ecosystem services and co-benefits. So by implementing nature-based solution or preserving them, we get various benefits as well. Heat mitigation, enhancing our mental well-being, providing recreational spaces. And another key benefit or advantage of nature-based solutions is their ability to adapt and grow and even recover. So after, for example, after a mangrove takes the brunt of a storm surge, they can eventually over time recover and grow. Some of the limitations though is, while there is a growing body of research, there's still relatively little practice experience and knowledge on the effectiveness of nature-based solutions, especially compared to traditional engineered infrastructure. And with this, there's a need for collaboration among stakeholders, agencies, scientific institutions to facilitate the research to improve implementation of nature-based solutions. John, do you have anything to add? Or
yeah, I guess since you talked quite a bit about the benefits, I also mentioned some of the limitations, or maybe challenges is a better word. So I think with nature-based solutions, there are two, I guess, relative downsides versus a purely engineered solution that we need to grapple with. So one is it tends to require more land, and Singapore being land scarce, this means that we can't deploy the same kinds of nature-based solutions everywhere, right? So for instance, you don't have space to plant a mangrove in the CBD area. But when places are land constrained, there are still going to be solutions we can do that will restore biodiversity into the urban matrix. So for instance, seawall enhancement, or like hybrid seawall systems. Yeah. Another is that nature is, well, it's rarely 100%, right? So like for instance, with a mangrove, you don't expect it to have the same degree of 100% protection as a engineered seawall, because nature is, the way nature works is that it has a certain degree of risk tolerance. Maybe in a once in 100 year or once in 1,000 year storm, there's no point trying to fight something like that, right? So the natural ecosystem is willing to, is able to kind of tolerate these occasional impacts. But when you have critical infrastructure in the city, sometimes you can't tolerate the kind of risk. So again, it depends a lot on what you're trying to protect. If it's a very important piece of infrastructure, like a highway, an MRT line, or a power plant, you might not be able to have the same degree of risk appetite. But if you're talking about places like parkland, where it's actually okay if it floods every X number of years, then nature-based solutions become a lot more suitable there. Yeah.
Zestin and Jonathan for the very holistic assessment of nature-based solutions. Maybe now I could ask Dan if he has anything else to add on.
No, I think those responses were great, and I think just to reiterate that nature-based solutions may not always be a complete replacement for engineered structures, but certainly working in concert with them will be able to make things much more cost-effective and have all of those additional benefits that everybody talked about as well. So yeah, thanks.
All right, great. So let's move on to the next question. So the next question is, how do we conserve mangrove forests with the rising of sea levels? So for this question, maybe Dan, you could kick us off first, and then Zestin and John could add on.
Well, thank you. So since 2011, we've been measuring in Singapore in a couple of different sites how mangroves are keeping pace with sea level rise or not. And I think the first thing to think about is that, yes, we do think sea level rise is a threat, but actually our mangroves show an amazing capacity to adapt. They're able to trap sediments in the water, and their elevation of their surface is able to rise at this, hopefully the same rate as sea level rise. And this is exactly what we've been monitoring now for over a decade. And we're showing that actually that process can happen. But it only happens if there's enough mud floating around in the water that the mangrove can then trap and consolidate on its surface to keep pace. So the first thing we can do to help conserve mangrove forests is to ensure that we have a suitable sediment supply in the broader coastal zone, so that we give mangroves the best fighting chance. The second thing we can do is not just is allowing mangroves to keep pace and move up with sea level rise, but we also can help our mangroves to move back with sea level rise. So the more landward areas of our mangroves are at higher elevations. And so as sea level rise increases, mangroves can migrate landwards to higher elevations and keep pace with sea level that way. And actually just a few weeks ago, we published a study that showed even in an area as land constrained as Singapore, we actually have areas where mangroves can move landward, particularly on some of our offshore islands, but even in some places on the main island. We might have to be a bit more creative in terms of how we incorporate and manage land behind mangroves to allow them to migrate, but certainly there is potential to do it. So there are at least two key ways that even with rapid rates of sea level rise, we can give mangroves in Singapore the best fighting chance.
Thanks for that, Dan. Maybe Zestin and Jonathan, would you guys have anything else to add on?
I totally agree with what Dan shared. I think that was really comprehensive and really helpful. I think just when we, I think as we recognize the importance of mangroves and their various benefits, we focus on ensuring that they continue to be healthy, continue to monitor them, and look specifically at what Dan said, the ability to keep pace, ability to build up sediment and rise in elevation, keeping pace with sea levels, and the opportunities for them to retreat backwards as well inland.
Right. Great.
Yeah, I also wanted to point out, like, a lot of the processes that Dan mentioned basically involve helping to facilitate the right environment, and then mangroves can adapt on their own, right? So we don't need to go in and plant mangroves everywhere if we want to conserve them. We just need to provide the right environment for them to adapt, and they'll do it on their own.
Yeah. So that is great to know. We're ending on a high note. So I want to thank Dan as well as Jonathan and Zestin again for the sharing as well as for the Q&A session. Unfortunately, due to time constraint, this would be the last question that we'll be taking. But I noted that some of you guys have actually sent your question on the Zoom chat. So we will definitely follow up with you guys on email to address the questions that you might have. Yeah, so I'd like to give a big thank you to our wonderful audience for joining us today. We hope that you have really gleaned some insights into how nature-based solutions can contribute to coastal protection in the face of climate change. With that, we have come to the end of the webinar, but before you go off and enjoy the rest of your Saturday, we would greatly appreciate if you could take a few minutes to fill in the feedback form for today's webinar to let us know how we can better improve. Do also continue to stay connected with us via the various social media platforms such as Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and Twitter, and we'll be sharing the links in the Zoom chat. With that, we thank you and wish you a wonderful day ahead.